to record this. So again, we'll do a couple of examples here. The first one, we've got 3 sine A minus 2 equals sine A minus 2. Now again, we are going to, most of these problems here we're doing here early in the week, we're going to just give you the ability to utilize your calculator. So we're not really asking you to utilize your unit circle. Again, since I'm only seeing you twice during the week, we've kind of tried to make this a little bit easier for you. And I think the Delta Math should give you some good feedback as you're working through some of these problems. But to kind of think about it in terms of algebra, I think a good thing to do is if you take your 2 sine A's and you just substitute in an x to do your solving. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to substitute in an x wherever the sine of A is. And what that does is that creates just basically a basic algebra equation for us. So all I'm doing is I'm saying that x is equal to the sine of A. And just doing some substitution. Well, you know, from algebra class, we know that to solve for x, we're going to get the x's together. So I'm going to subtract an x. Well, that gives me negative 4x minus 2 equals negative 2. Then I'm going to add 2 to both sides. So I get negative 4x equals 0. And then if I divide by negative 4, x equals 0. Now, if I substitute, I know that x is the same as sine A. Basically, what this is saying is the sine of A is equal to 0. Now, I want you to kind of think back to when we talked about the unit circle. You're still going to need to remember your little saying, and that is, all students think college. And hopefully you remember what that means. Basically, that means in the first quadrant, all of our trig, sine, cosine, tangent are positive in the first quadrant. In the second quadrant, we know that sine is positive. In the third quadrant, tangent is positive. And in the fourth quadrant, cosine is positive. So hopefully we remember that. Now, for this one, and again, I hope you also remember kind of what we talked about. We know that sine is kind of equal to the x value. No, I've got that backwards. Sine is the y value. Cosine is the x value. So when you're thinking about this, sine of A equals 0. Well, that's not positive or negative. So this is a situation where the angle we're talking about is going to be, you know, on one of our axes or one of our axes. Well, where is y equal to 0? Now, if you were to put a point on the axis, we know this point is 1, 0. We know this point is 1, 1. We know this point is, what do we got? Negative 1, 0. We know this point here would be 0, negative 1. So when you're thinking about, you know, where is sine or where's the y value going to be 0, we see it's going to be 0 here, and we see it's going to be 0 here. So that would be 0 degrees and 180 degrees. Now, where I said we were going to be utilizing our calculators, you know, if I were to type into my calculator the inverse sine of 0, so second sine 0, and hit enter, I get 0. Now, the reason we have to use the unit circle is because the calculator is not going to give you both answers. Does that make sense? It's going to give you the 0, but it's not going to give you the other quadrant. So that's why, when you're doing these problems, you do have to check for both answers. The other thing, I had a few people ask me this on the Delta Math. They said, well, I'm getting my 2 answers, but I don't know how to enter it in to get the correct answer. So when you've got the 2 answers on Delta Math, you do have to type in your first answer, and then you have to hit the comma, and then type in your second. When you hit the comma, it gives you the second blank to type it in. So hopefully that makes sense to you with that. Let's do one that's not going to fall on the axis. So this will be kind of the second one. Kind of example 2. Let's say I have -4 sine C minus 2 equals sine of C plus 1. So again, just to sub it in, make it a little bit easier, I'm going to say that x is equal to the sine of C. So I'm going to substitute in x. So I've got -4x minus 2 equals x plus 1. Just by doing that, it makes it a pretty easy, few-step equation here. So if I, again, subtract my x, I get -5x minus 2 equals 1. If I add 2 to both sides, -5x equals 3. And if I divide by -5, x equals -3/5. So if I sub my sign back in, basically I've got the sine of C equals -3/5. So again, here's where your calculator comes into play. We're going to solve for C. So C is equal to the inverse sine -3/5. So let's go ahead and type that into our calculator. Second sine, and then -3/5. Actually, you have to put in 3/5. So that gives you, again, on these, they're rounding them to the nearest tenth. So 36.9 is what we get there. Now, what we're going to do with that value is we're going to go back to our coordinates. And again, all students think college. So which quadrants is the sign going to be negative? Now, hopefully you recognize that it's going to be negative in both the third quadrant and the fourth quadrant. So to get my value in the third quadrant, I'm going to do 180 degrees plus my 36.9 that we just got on our calculator. So again, I do 180 plus 36.9, and that should give you 216.9. So there's my first answer to that equation. Again, that would be when it's in the third quadrant. Now, the fourth quadrant, I'm going to do 360 minus that 36.9. And when I do 360 minus that 36.9, I get 223.1 degrees. 323, what did I say? So 223.1.